They called her Mouse from day one at Fort Riverside, snickering when the 5-0 recruit barely met the height requirements. 3 weeks later, when she sent Drill Sergeant Jackson Tank Morrison, all 250 pounds of him, flying across the combat training ground like a rag doll, the laughter died in their throats. What none of them knew was that Sarah Chen had been hiding a secret that would shake the very foundations of military training protocol. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Chen had mastered the art of blending in. At 23, she moved through her small apartment in Sacramento like someone apologizing for taking up space. Her neighbors in the rundown complex barely noticed her, just another quiet girl working 2 jobs to make ends meet. She stocked shelves at Target during the day and cleaned office buildings at night, her petite frame making her nearly invisible among the corporate workers rushing past. But invisibility had always been Sarah's survival mechanism. Growing up in foster care had taught her that being noticed often meant being hurt. She'd learned to make herself small, to speak softly, to never draw attention. Even her co-workers barely knew her name. To them, she was just a tiny Asian girl who worked harder than anyone else and never complained. The only hint of something different lay hidden in her studio apartment. While the space was sparse and unremarkable, one corner held a carefully maintained collection of martial arts trophies, most dating back to her teenage years. They were dusty now, relegated to a dark corner where visiting social workers or landlords wouldn't notice them. Sarah would sometimes catch herself staring at them during sleepless nights, remembering a version of herself that felt like a distant dream. Her decision to enlist came after another dead-end performance review at Target. Her supervisor, a man half her age with twice her arrogance, had passed her over for a promotion she'd earned 3 times over. "You're just not leadership material, Sarah," he'd said, not even looking up from his clipboard. "Maybe try the stockroom. Less interaction with customers." That night, walking home through Sacramento's empty streets, Sarah passed a military recruitment office. The poster in the window showed a diverse group of soldiers, men and women of all sizes, with the slogan "Army Strong" emblazoned below. For the first time in years, something stirred inside her chest. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. The recruiter, Staff Sergeant Williams, had been enthusiastic when she walked in the next morning. "The Army needs people like you," he'd assured her, though his eyes betrayed a hint of doubt as he took in her diminutive stature. "We'll make a soldier out of you." He'd painted a picture of opportunity, of training that would unlock her potential, of a system that rewarded merit over politics. What he hadn't mentioned were the whispers that followed her through the military entrance processing station, the barely concealed smirks when she struggled to reach equipment designed for average height recruits, the way other enlistees sized her up like predators evaluating prey. Sarah absorbed it all with the same quiet resignation she'd perfected over 23 years of being underestimated. The night before shipping out to Fort Riverside, Sarah sat in her empty apartment. She'd given up the lease, burning her bridges with characteristic thoroughness. Her trophies were packed away in a storage unit, along with any evidence of who she'd once been. She'd spent years building a new identity around being forgettable, unremarkable, safe. Now she was voluntarily walking into an environment designed to break people down and rebuild them. But as she traced the faded scar on her left wrist, a reminder of her last martial arts competition 7 years ago, Sarah felt something she'd forgotten existed. Not quite courage, but its precursor. The recognition that hiding hadn't protected her from humiliation anyway. Maybe it was time to try a different approach. Her phone buzzed with a text from her former foster sister Jenny, the only person who'd stayed in touch over the years. "Heard you enlisted. Proud of you, sis. Show them what we Sacramento girls are made of." Attached was a photo from their teenage years, Sarah holding a regional martial arts championship trophy, her face fierce with determination. She looked like a different person. She'd been a different person. Sarah deleted the message and the photo, as she had with all reminders of her past. Tomorrow she would begin the transformation from Sarah Chen, invisible girl, to whatever the Army decided to make her. She'd survived foster care, poverty, and years of being overlooked. How hard could basic training be? As she lay in bed that final night, Sarah's hand instinctively moved through the motions of a defensive sequence she'd practiced thousands of times as a teenager. Her muscles remembered what her mind had tried to forget. Some skills, once learned, never fully disappeared. They just waited, dormant, for the right moment to resurface. Outside her window, Sacramento slept peacefully, unaware that one of its most underestimated daughters was about to embark on a journey that would reveal exactly how dangerous it could be to judge someone by their size. The quiet girl who'd spent years perfecting the art of being overlooked was about to discover that sometimes the smallest packages contained the biggest surprises. In 12 hours, she would meet Drill Sergeant Morrison. In 3 weeks, she would change everything. But tonight, Sarah Chen allowed herself one last moment of being nobody special, because she somehow knew it would be the last time she could make that claim. The bus ride to Fort Riverside felt like a journey to another planet. Sarah pressed her face against the window, watching California's landscape blur past, while her fellow recruits filled the vehicle with nervous energy and bravado. Most of them were barely out of high school, all swagger and untested confidence. They traded stories about high school football glory and street fights, each tale growing more elaborate with each telling. "What about you, Tiny?" called out a massive recruit, named Brandon Torres, from the back of the bus. At 6'4" and easily 220 pounds, he dominated the space around him like gravity. "What's your story? You look like you should be heading to community college, not boot camp." Laughter rippled through the bus. Sarah kept her eyes on the window, watching telephone poles flash by like a rhythmic heartbeat. She'd learned long ago that responding to provocation only invited more attention. Better to be forgotten than to become a target. "I'm talking to you, Mouse," Torres pressed, using a nickname that hadn't even been officially assigned yet, but somehow fit perfectly. "Cat got your tongue?" "Leave her alone, Brandon," said a voice from the middle of the bus. Sarah glanced back to see Marcus Thompson, a lean recruit from Oakland with kind eyes and a slight southern drawl. "She's not bothering anyone. Just trying to be friendly," Torres replied, but his attention shifted to Thompson, sensing a more entertaining target. Sarah shot Marcus a grateful look before turning back to the window. Fort Riverside appeared on the horizon like a fortress from another era. Chain-link fences topped with razor wiring closed acres of identical buildings, training grounds and obstacle courses that looked designed by someone who enjoyed human suffering. The bus slowed as it approached the main gate, where stone-faced guards checked documentation with military precision. "Welcome to hell, ladies and gentlemen," muttered the bus driver, a grizzled veteran who's seen it all. Expression suggested he'd delivered thousands of recruits to their fate over the years. The bus lurched to a stop in front of an imposing brick building marked Reception Station. Before anyone could process what was happening, the doors flew open and 3 drill sergeants stormed aboard like natural disasters given human form. "Get off my bus! Move, move!" The voice belonged to Drill Sergeant Jackson Morrison, and it hit Sarah like a physical force. At 6 feet 2 inches and 250 pounds of solid muscle, Morrison filled the bus aisle like a force of nature. His campaign hat cast shadows that made his face look carved from granite, and his voice could probably be heard in neighboring counties. Chaos erupted as 35 recruits tried to exit, simultaneously through a single door. Torres for all. His earlier bravado looked like he'd swallowed his tongue. Thompson moved with quiet efficiency, helping others while staying out of the drill sergeant's direct line of fire. Sarah, being smallest, found herself carried along by the crowd like debris in a flood. Form a line, nitrogen monoxide, not like that. Like soldiers. Morrison's voice seemed to physically push them into formation. You people look like a yard sale. Where's your military bearing? Sarah ended up near the back of the formation, which suited her perfectly. From there, she could observe without being noticed. Morrison paced in front of them like a caged predator, his steel-gray eyes cataloging every weakness, every fear, every hint of defiance. Listen up, maggots. I am Drill Sergeant Morrison, and for the next 16 weeks, I own your pathetic lives. You will eat when I say eat, sleep when I say sleep, and breathe when I give you permission. His gaze swept the formation, lingering on each recruit just long enough to make them squirm. When his eyes reached Sarah, she felt like a mouse being studied by a hawk. Morrison's expression didn't change, but she caught something that might have been amusement. Some of you think you're tough, Morrison continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to the back of the formation. Some of you think you know what hard work means. You are wrong, dead wrong. Before I'm done with you, you'll discover muscles you didn't know existed and fear levels that would make your nightmares jealous. A recruit near the front Sarah recognized. Him as Jake Miller from the bus made the mistake of smirking. Morrison materialized in front of him so quickly it seemed like teleportation. Something funny, recruit? Morrison's face was inches from Miller's, close enough that Sarah could see Miller's Adam's apple bobbing frantically. No, Drill Sergeant. Nitrogen monoxide, what? No, Drill Sergeant Morrison. Better, but not good enough. Morrison stepped back and addressed the entire formation. This recruit thinks basic training is a joke. Who else thinks this is funny? Silence thick enough to cut with a knife settled over the group. Sarah could hear Torres breathing heavily somewhere to her left, could sense Thompson's tension radiating from her right. Morrison let the moment stretch until the anticipation became unbearable. Nobody? Good. Because what we do here is serious business. We turn civilians into soldiers, boys into men, and his gaze found Sarah again. Children into warriors. The word children hit Sarah like a slap. She felt 34 pairs of eyes turned toward her, felt the weight of assumption and prejudgment settling on her shoulders like a familiar coat. Morrison hadn't used her name, but everyone knew who he meant. Echo Company will be your home, your family, and your worst nightmare all rolled into one beautiful package. Morrison continued. You will learn to fight, to follow orders, and to function as a unit. Those who can't keep up will be sent home to mommy with their tails between their legs. Again, his eyes found Sarah. The message was clear. He'd already decided who wouldn't make a dot as they were marched toward the barracks. Sarah caught fragments of whispered conversations from her fellow recruits. Words like liability and dead weight, and why did they even let her in, followed her like a toxic cloud. By the time they reached their assigned sleeping quarters, the nickname Mouse had spread through the group with viral efficiency. That night, lying on a narrow bunk that felt harder than concrete, Sarah stared at the ceiling and listened to Torres holding court about how he'd carry the little girl through training if necessary. The conversation was loud enough to ensure she heard every word. Marcus Thompson, bless him, tried to shut it down. Give her a chance, man. You don't know what she's capable of. I can see what she's capable of, Torres shot back. Nothing. She's gonna wash out in the first week, mark my words. Sarah pulled her thin pillow over her head and tried to block out the voices. Tomorrow would bring physical training, obstacle courses, and a dozen other opportunities for public humiliation. She'd survived worse, she told herself. She could survive this too, but as sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's hands unconsciously moved through the motions of defensive sequences her body remembered better than her mind. Some instincts ran deeper than conscious thought, and some quiet, Mice, when cornered, revealed themselves to be something far more dangerous than anyone expected. The first week of basic training revealed the systematic nature of military humiliation. It wasn't random cruelty, it was designed, methodical, and brutally effective. Sarah discovered that being the smallest recruit made her a lightning rod. For every form of motivation, the drill sergeants could devise. It started with PT, physical training that began before dawn and felt like it lasted until doomsday. While other recruits struggled with push-ups and sit-ups, Sarah's smaller frame meant she had to work twice as hard to meet the same standards. Morrison seemed to take personal pleasure in pointing this out. "Chen, are you doing push-ups or taking a nap down there?" His voice boomed across the training field as Sarah's arms trembled on her 10th repetition. Around her, recruits like Torres were powering through sets with the casual ease of natural athletes. 20 more, Mouse," Morrison added, using the nickname that had now become official. "Maybe that'll teach you that the Army doesn't have a size requirement, because we're running a daycare." Laughter rippled through the formation. Sarah gritted her teeth and continued, her form perfect even as her muscles screamed. She'd learned perfect technique years ago, when proper form meant the difference between winning and losing. Now it meant the difference between surviving and washing out. The obstacle course was worse. The rope climb required upper body strength. That challenged even the biggest recruits. The wall climb demanded reach that Sarah simply didn't possess. The monkey bars designed for soldiers with longer arms left, her dangling helplessly as drill sergeants timed her struggles with theatrical precision. 47 seconds to fail one obstacle. Staff Sergeant Williams announced to the assembled company, "That's got to be some kind of record. Chen, my grandmother could move faster than that, and she's been dead for 6 years." The worst part wasn't the physical challenges. Sarah's body was adapting, growing stronger, finding ways to compensate. The worst part was watching her fellow recruits turn against her. In the military's zero-sum game of collective punishment, one person's failure meant everyone suffered. When Sarah couldn't complete the rope climb in the allotted time, the entire company ran extra laps. When she fell from the monkey bars, everyone dropped for additional push-ups. When she struggled with the heavy equipment carry, the whole unit lost their evening privileges. Torres made sure she understood the connection. "Thanks to Mouse, we're eating cold chow again tonight," he announced loudly enough for the entire mess hall to hear. "Hope everyone's enjoying their military gourmet experience." The female recruits were particularly vicious. Amanda Hayes, a former college athlete who'd enlisted for the officer track, led the charge with cutting precision. "Some people just aren't cut out for this," she'd say during equipment checks, making sure Sarah heard. "It's not her fault she's physically inadequate, but why should the rest of us suffer for it?" Jennifer Parker, desperate to fit in with the stronger personalities, echoed every criticism. "My little brother could probably outperform her," she whispered to Hayes, loud enough for Sarah to catch every word. "Why don't they just send her home and save everyone the trouble?" Even Marcus Thompson, who'd initially defended her, began keeping his distance. The social pressure was too intense, the collective punishment too frequent. Sarah watched him choose self-preservation over sympathy and couldn't blame him. She'd have done the same thing. The breaking point came during combat training in week 2. The drill involved partner sparring basic self-defense techniques that every soldier needed to master. Morrison paired recruits strategically, usually matching similar sizes and skill levels. When Sarah's turn came, he smiled with predatory satisfaction. "Chen, you're with Torres. Let's see what that fighting spirit looks like." The mismatch was so obvious it bordered on criminal. Torres outweighed Sarah by nearly 100 pounds and had 6 inches of reach advantage. The exercise was supposed to be controlled, technical practice. Instead, it became a public execution. "Go easy on her, Torres," Morrison called out with mock concern. We don't want to break our little warrior." Torres, playing to his audience, didn't go easy. He didn't go hard enough to seriously injure her, but he used enough force to make a point. Sarah found herself on the mat repeatedly, each takedown drawing cheers from the assembled recruits. She rolled with the throws, used her smaller size to avoid the worst impacts, but couldn't prevent the systematic humiliation. "Stay down, Mouse," Torres whispered during one grapple. "You're embarrassing yourself." But Sarah kept getting up. Each time Torres put her down, she rose again. Her technique was better than his years of training had given her knowledge. He couldn't match, but the size difference was insurmountable in this context. She couldn't use her real skills without revealing who she'd once been. The session ended. With Sarah on her back, Torres standing over her like a conquering hero. Morrison slow clapped sarcastically. "Outstanding demonstration, Chun. Really showed us what determination looks like in the face of inevitable defeat." That evening, Sarah sat alone in the mess hall while conversations swirled around her. She heard Torres regaling anyone who'd listen with an increasingly embellished version of their sparring session. Hayes discussed her concerns about dead weight in their unit. Parker wondered aloud why the Army had lowered standards enough to let people like Sarah enlist. The food on her tray grew cold as Sarah stared at her reflection in the plastic spoon. The face looking back was bruised, exhausted, defeated. It was the face of someone who'd forgotten she'd ever been anything more than a victim. But underneath the surface, something else was stirring. 7 years of suppression hadn't erased the muscle memory, the tactical thinking, the bone-deep knowledge of exactly how to neutralize opponents twice her size. It had just taught her to hide it so well she'd almost forgotten it existed. That night, alone in the shower after lights out, Sarah allowed herself to move through a single kata, a flowing sequence of strikes and blocks that her body performed with unconscious precision. For 60 seconds, she wasn't Mouse Chen, struggling recruit. She was someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. Then she heard footsteps and immediately returned to her careful, harmless persona. But the awakening had begun. The question wasn't whether Sarah would break under the pressure. The question was what would happen when she finally decided to push back. Morrison and his systematic humiliation campaign had no idea they were poking a sleeping dragon. Soon, very soon, they would discover that the smallest recruits sometimes carried the biggest surprises. And some mice, when pushed too far, revealed themselves to be apex predators in disguise. Week 3 brought new horrors disguised as advanced training. Sarah had thought the worst was behind her, that she'd found her rhythm in the brutal ecosystem of basic training. She was wrong. Morrison and his staff had simply been warming up. The escalation began with equipment sabotage, so subtle it seemed like accidents. Sarah's rifle would be mysteriously dirty during inspections, earning her extra cleaning duties and public reprimands. Her boots would be untied during morning formations, making her late and subjecting the entire company to collective punishment. Her locker would be found in violation of regulations she was certain she'd followed to the letter. Chun seems to have trouble with basic military standards, Morrison announced during one particularly humiliating inspection. Perhaps she needs some additional motivation to pay attention to details. The additional motivation involved Sarah spending her few free hours performing remedial tasks while other recruits rested or socialized. She scrubbed toilets that weren't dirty, reorganized supply closets that were already perfect, and polished boots until her fingers bled. Each task was designed to isolate her further from her fellow recruits and reinforce her status as the company failure. But the psychological warfare was just beginning. Morrison had studied Sarah's file, noticed her lack of family contacts, her foster care background, her complete absence of support systems. He used this knowledge like a surgeon wielding a scalpel. Must be nice not having anyone who cares whether you succeed or fail, he commented during mail call, making sure everyone heard. No pressure from disappointed parents, no girlfriend. wondering why her boyfriend can't hack basic training. Must be liberating to be completely alone in the world. The words hit harder than any physical blow. Sarah maintained her neutral expression, but inside, something cracked. Morrison had found her deepest vulnerability, the lifelong certainty that she was fundamentally unworthy of love or loyalty. Hayes and Parker escalated their campaign with the cruelty that only comes from pack dynamics. They began excluding Sarah from informal group activities, speaking around her as if she didn't exist, sharing inside jokes that highlighted her outsider status. When Sarah tried to contribute to conversations, they'd exchange glances and change the subject. Some people just don't get social cues, Hayes observed loudly during chow time. They keep trying to insert themselves where they're not wanted. The isolation was methodical and complete. Even Thompson, who'd shown her early kindness, now treated her with polite distance. The social pressure was too intense, the consequences of association too severe. Sarah found herself eating alone, training alone, existing in a bubble of carefully maintained invisibility. The physical challenges intensified as well. Morrison began assigning Sarah tasks clearly designed for larger recruits. She'd be partnered with Torres for equipment carries that required 2 people of equal strength. She'd be given heavy weapons assignments that left her struggling visibly while others handled them with ease. "Chen, you're on M240 duty today," Morrison announced during weapons training. The M240 machine gun weighed nearly 30 pounds, a significant burden for someone Sarah's size. "Hope you've been eating your Wheaties." Laughter followed her as she struggled to maneuver the weapon through combat positions. The barrel kept dipping because she lacked the upper body strength to hold it steady for extended periods. Her shooting accuracy suffered as fatigue set in, earning more criticism and more collective punishment for her unit. "Maybe we should get her a smaller gun," Torres suggested during cleanup. "They make toy versions for children." The breaking point seemed to arrive during hand-to-hand combat training. Morrison had brought in a visiting instructor, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a combat veteran with a reputation for brutal honesty about recruits' capabilities. "Today we separate the warriors from the wannabes," Rodriguez announced to the assembled company. "Real combat doesn't care about your feelings. Real enemies don't give participation trophies." Sarah knew what was coming before Morrison called her name. This wouldn't be controlled sparring with safety protocols. This would be designed humiliation disguised as realistic training. "Chen, front and center. Rodriguez, show us what happens when someone who shouldn't be here meets someone who belongs." Rodriguez was smaller than Torres, but infinitely more dangerous. Military combat training, years of deployment experience, and the casual confidence of someone who'd used these skills in life or death situations. Sarah faced him knowing the outcome was predetermined. What followed was systematic dismantling. Rodriguez didn't hurt her seriously. Too many witnesses, too many regulations, but he demonstrated exactly how helpless she was against a trained opponent. Each takedown was textbook perfect, each submission hold applied with just enough pressure to make her tap out immediately. "This is what real combat looks like," Morrison narrated for the audience. "Chen's enthusiasm is admirable, but enthusiasm doesn't stop bullets or win fights. Sometimes the kindest thing is honesty about limitations." Sarah tapped out 6 times in as many minutes. Each submission drew approving nods from the drill staff and uncomfortable silence from her fellow recruits. By the end, she was gasping for air, her body screaming from the controlled violence of professional-level grappling. "Outstanding demonstration," Morrison concluded. "Rodriguez, show them what adequate training looks like." Torres volunteered immediately, eager to redeem the company's reputation. His session with Rodriguez was competitive, respectful, and lasted 15 minutes. When it ended, both men were breathing hard, and Rodriguez offered genuine compliments about Torres' potential. That Evening, Sarah sat in her bunk while conversations buzzed around her. She heard Torres being praised for his performance, heard Hayes and Parker discussing how embarrassing it was to have Chun represent their company, heard whispered speculation about when she'd finally quit. The face in her small mirror looked back with empty eyes. 3 weeks of systematic humiliation had accomplished what Morrison intended, breaking down her sense of self, her confidence, her belief that she belonged anywhere. The martial arts champion she'd once been felt like a character from someone else's story. But broken things could be dangerous. And Sarah was beginning to remember that sometimes the most devastating attacks came from opponents nobody saw coming. The question wasn't whether she could survive Morrison's campaign. The question was what she'd become when survival required her to stop hiding who she really was. Deep in her muscle memory, 7 years of suppressed training waited for permission to resurface. Soon, very soon, someone was going to push too hard. And when that happened, Mouse Chun would disappear forever, replaced by something Morrison had never encountered and wasn't prepared to handle. The revelation came by accident, buried in a conversation Sarah wasn't supposed to hear. She'd been assigned late-night cleaning duty in the administrative building, another of Morrison's creative punishments, when voices drifted from the drill sergeant's office. The door was slightly ajar, and 2 voices she recognized were speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "The Chun situation is getting out of hand," Staff Sergeant Williams was saying. "The other recruits are starting to ask questions about why we're singling her out so much." Morrison's laugh was cold and calculating. "Questions? Let them question. She's serving exactly the purpose she was meant to serve." Sarah froze, her mop handle slipping in suddenly sweaty palms. "Purpose? What purpose?" "Still," Williams continued, "Rodriguez thinks we might be pushing too hard. He mentioned her technique during that demonstration was actually pretty solid under all the intimidation." "Rodriguez doesn't understand the bigger picture," Morrison replied dismissively. "This isn't about her individual potential. It's about maintaining standards and proving a point. Some people don't belong here, and the sooner everyone accepts that reality, the better." Sarah crept closer to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. What she heard next changed everything. "Colonel Brennan called today," Williams said, his voice dropping even lower. "She's been getting reports about our training methods. Apparently, there have been complaints." "From who?" Morrison's voice sharpened dangerously. "Anonymous. Someone's been documenting incidents, filing reports through proper channels. Brennan wants to review our protocols, maybe send an observer." There was a long pause before Morrison spoke again, and when he did, his tone carried a menace that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Then we need to accelerate the timeline. If Chun washes out due to legitimate performance failures, there's nothing to investigate. But if she hangs around long enough for outside observers to start asking questions, you think she's the one filing reports? Who else? Little Miss Perfect Foster Kid probably thinks she can change the system through paperwork. Doesn't matter. By the time any investigation gets underway, she'd be gone, and Echo Company will be back to normal operations." Sarah's mind raced as the implications sank in. This wasn't random hazing or standard military toughening. This was a deliberate campaign to force her out before she could expose something bigger. But what was she threatening to expose? She hadn't filed any report. She'd been too focused on survival to even consider formal complaints. Unless someone else was watching, documenting, reporting on her behalf. Over the next few days, Sarah began paying attention to details she'd previously missed. The way certain drill sergeants would exchange glances when she succeeded at tasks despite the odds stacked against her. How Morrison's punishments seemed designed not just to humiliate, but to prevent her from demonstrating competence in front of witnesses. The careful choreography of who was present during her most challenging moments. She also noticed something else. She wasn't the only recruit receiving unusual treatment. During mess hall observations, she spotted patterns of isolation and targeted harassment directed at 3 other soldiers. Jake Miller, the recruit who'd smirked during Morrison's first speech, was now being systematically broken down through sleep deprivation and impossible standards. Maria Santos, a quiet Latina recruit who'd shown exceptional marksmanship skills, was suddenly failing weapons inspections despite meticulous preparation. Most telling was the treatment of David Kim, a Korean-American recruit whose older brother had reportedly filed complaints about training practices at another base the previous year. Kim was being subjected to the same isolation tactics as Sarah, the same impossible standards, the same collective punishment scenarios designed to turn fellow recruits against him. The pattern was clear. Morrison wasn't just targeting Sarah. He was systematically eliminating anyone who might pose a threat to his methods or his authority. The question was why these particular methods needed protecting. Sarah's breakthrough came during a late-night search of publicly available military records. Using computer skills she'd developed during her civilian jobs, she began researching Fort Riverside's recent history, looking for patterns in recruit outcomes, training incidents, and official complaints. What she found was disturbing. Over the past 2 years, Fort Riverside had developed a reputation for producing exceptionally disciplined soldiers through innovative training methods. Several military publications had featured articles praising Morrison's approach to breaking down civilian attitudes and rebuilding military mindset. But dig deeper, and different patterns emerged. An unusually high washout rate among recruits from certain demographic groups. A suspicious number of training injuries involving recruits who'd shown early promise. Medical reports describing stress fractures, psychological breaks, and mysterious performance degradations that couldn't be explained by normal training progression. Most damning was a series of settlement payments made by the military to families of former recruits. The amounts were modest enough to discourage lawsuits, but not enough to attract media attention. Each settlement included strict non-disclosure agreements, but the legal filings painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as legitimate. Training. Sarah discovered that Morrison's methods weren't just cruel, they were experimental. He was part of a pilot program designed to test accelerated psychological conditioning techniques. The goal was to identify breaking points in recruits and develop more efficient methods for weeding out unsuitable candidates early in the training process. The program had unofficial support from certain military officials who believed traditional basic training was too time-consuming and resource-intensive. By creating extreme stress conditions, they could identify weaknesses faster and eliminate recruits who might become problems later in their military careers. But the program required test subjects recruits who fit specific psychological profiles that made them ideal candidates for breaking. Foster care backgrounds, lack of support systems, histories of being underestimated or overlooked. Sarah fit the profile perfectly. The anonymous reports Williams had mentioned weren't coming from Sarah. They were coming from Dr. Michael Foster, a military psychologist who'd been assigned to monitor the pilot program and was growing increasingly concerned about its methods and outcomes. His reports were buried in bureaucracy, but they painted a picture of systematic abuse that violated military regulations and basic human dignity. As Sarah pieced together the full scope of what was happening, one thing became crystal clear. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival anymore. She was fighting against a system designed to break people like her. And her success or failure would determine whether Morrison's methods spread throughout the military or were exposed for the abuse they represented, the mouse they'd been trying to break was about to become the witness who brought down their entire operation. But first, she had to survive long enough to fight back. And that meant it was time to stop hiding what she was truly capable of. Morrison had wanted to test her breaking point. Soon, he was going to discover that some people don't break, they explode. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Sarah's investigation deepened over the following week, conducted in stolen moments between training exercises and punishment duties. She developed a system of gathering evidence that would have impressed any detective using her cleaning assignments to access different parts of the base, her computer skills to dig through military databases, and her invisibility to observe conversations she wasn't meant to hear. The picture that emerged was more disturbing than she'd initially imagined. Morrison's accelerated psychological conditioning program wasn't just happening at Fort Riverside. She found evidence of similar experiments at 3 other training facilities across the country, all led by drill sergeants who'd received special training in advanced motivational techniques. The program had a clinical name, Project Resilience Assessment Protocol. Its stated goal was to identify recruits with insufficient psychological fortitude before they could become liabilities in combat situations. The unofficial goal was far more sinister: to develop methods for systematically eliminating soldiers who might question orders, challenge authority, or expose misconduct. Dr. Foster's reports, which Sarah accessed through a combination of legitimate research databases and carefully exploited security gaps, painted a picture of escalating abuse disguised as legitimate training. His documentation was meticulous, clinical, and damning. Subject exhibits classic symptoms of systematic psychological conditioning designed to induce learned helplessness. Read one report about a recruit Sarah didn't recognize. Training methods appear designed not to strengthen resilience but to identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities for the purpose of elimination. Another report was more direct. Drill Sergeant Morrison's methods violate established protocols for military training. The psychological stress being applied exceeds recommended levels and appears designed to cause permanent psychological damage rather than temporary conditioning. Most telling was Foster's most recent report, dated just 3 days earlier. Urgent intervention required. Current methods have resulted in 2 attempted suicides, 1 permanent psychological disability discharge, and systematic documentation of abuse that violates military regulations and federal law. Recommend immediate suspension of program and investigation of all participating personnel. Sarah printed everything she could access, using the administrative building's computers during her assigned cleaning times. She created hidden copies, storing evidence in multiple locations throughout the base. If something happened to her, the documentation would survive, but she also began documenting new evidence in real time, using a small camera she'd purchased. During her one authorized base shopping trip, she began recording interactions with Morrison and his staff. The camera was disguised as a pen small enough to be invisible, but capable of capturing both audio and video. Her first major breakthrough came during a staff meeting she overheard while cleaning the conference room. Morrison was briefing other drill sergeants about problem recruits and methods for accelerating their departure. "Chun's resilience is actually becoming problematic," Morrison was saying, unaware that Sarah was documenting every word from behind a partially closed door. "The protocol assumes most subjects will break within 4 weeks. She's approaching week 5 and still functioning. What about increasing physical stress?" suggested another drill sergeant Sarah recognized as Staff Sergeant Johnson from Bravo Company, already maximized. "Any more would trigger automatic medical review. We need psychological pressure that won't leave official documentation." "Family pressure?" Williams suggested. Morrison's laugh was cold. "She doesn't have family. That's why she was selected. Foster care background, no support system. No one to ask questions if she disappears." Sarah's blood ran cold. Disappears? Were they planning something beyond forcing her to quit? "The beauty of this program," Morrison continued, "is that failures look like natural washouts. Recruits who can't handle military life, who break under legitimate pressure. No one questions why certain types of people consistently fail basic training." "What about Foster's reports?" Johnson asked. Foster's being transferred next month. His replacement is more understanding of operational realities. By the time any real investigation gets started, this group will have graduated or washed out and will have refined our methods for the next cycle. The conversation shifted to specific tactics for accelerating psychological breakdown in resistant subjects. Sarah listened to them discuss sleep deprivation techniques, isolation methods, and ways to turn fellow recruits against targeted individuals. It was a masterclass in systematic abuse, delivered with the casual efficiency of people who'd perfected their craft. Most disturbing was their discussion of success metrics. They weren't measuring how many recruits they successfully trained. They were measuring how efficiently they could identify and eliminate undesirable elements from the military pipeline. The goal isn't to break everyone, Morrison explained. It's to identify who breaks and how quickly. That information helps us predict performance in actual combat situations and eliminate potential problems before they become liabilities. After the meeting ended and the drill sergeants departed, Sarah remained hidden for another hour, processing what she'd heard. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about systematically eliminating anyone who didn't fit Morrison's vision of ideal soldiers, people from backgrounds like hers, people who'd learned resilience through adversity rather than privilege. Over the next few days, Sarah expanded her investigation to include other recruits who'd washed out of previous training cycles. Using military databases and social media searches, she tracked down former recruits who'd left Fort Riverside under mysterious circumstances. The stories were heartbreakingly similar. Jake Thompson, who'd washed out 6 months earlier, described systematic harassment that escalated until he suffered a complete psychological breakdown. "They made me believe I was worthless," he told Sarah during a late-night phone call. "Made everyone around me believe it too. I started having panic attacks, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Finally just couldn't take it anymore." Maria Rodriguez, a former recruit who'd shown exceptional leadership potential, described being subjected to impossible standards and constant humiliation. "I was going to be an officer," she said, her voice still carrying the pain of shattered dreams. "Had letters of recommendation, perfect scores on everything. But they found ways to make me fail that had nothing to do with my actual abilities." The pattern was consistent across dozens of former recruits. Each had shown promise in areas that seemed to threaten Morrison's authority or challenge his methods. Each had been systematically broken down using techniques designed to look like legitimate training failures. But Sarah also discovered something else in her research evidence, that some recruits had fought back successfully. A former Marine named David Park had documented his experience and filed successful complaints that led to disciplinary action against 2 drill instructors at another base. His methods provided a blueprint for effective resistance. "The key," Park had written in a forum post, "is documentation and witnesses. They rely on isolation and the assumption that no one will believe a recruit over a drill sergeant. But if you can prove systematic abuse and get outside support, the military takes it seriously." Park had also shared tactical advice about surviving the psychological pressure. "Remember who you are underneath all the noise. They're trying to convince you that you're weak, worthless, incapable. But they wouldn't be working so hard to break you if they weren't afraid of what you might become." As Sarah compiled her evidence and planned her next moves, she felt something shifting inside her. The mouse they'd been trying to break was remembering she'd once been a predator. The quiet girl who'd spent years hiding her capabilities was rediscovering the warrior she'd forced herself to forget. Morrison's accelerated conditioning program was about to encounter something it wasn't designed to handle, someone who refused to break, who fought back with intelligence and evidence, and who carried skills that could turn the tables on her tormentors. The question was no longer whether Sarah would survive basic training. The question was whether Morrison's entire operation would survive Sarah. Week 6 brought what Morrison clearly intended as Sarah's finale. The exercise was called Combat Reality Assessment, a comprehensive test designed to simulate real battlefield conditions under maximum stress. For most recruits, it was an opportunity to demonstrate everything they'd learned. For Sarah, it was orchestrated as her public execution. The assessment took place in front of visiting officials from Fort Bragg, including Colonel Patricia Brennan herself. Morrison had specifically requested their presence, claiming he wanted to showcase innovative training methodologies and their effectiveness in identifying combat-ready soldiers. That Sarah knew it was a setup from the moment she saw the roster. Every other recruit had been paired with partners of similar size and skill level. Sarah was assigned to work with Torres and Hayes, the two most physically dominant recruits in the company, in scenarios designed for three-person teams of equal capability. "This will be interesting," Morrison announced as he briefed the observers. "Chen represents a perfect case study in the importance of realistic physical standards. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is demonstrate natural limitations before they become fatal liabilities in combat." The first scenario was a timed equipment carry across rough terrain. Each team had to transport heavy gear, including ammunition, medical supplies, and communication equipment. Sarah's team received the heaviest load, and Morrison made sure the observers noted the deliberate challenge. In real combat, enemies don't adjust their tactics based on the smallest soldier's limitations, he explained to Colonel Brennan. Every weak link endangers the entire unit. Sarah struggled with her portion of the load, a radio pack that weighed nearly 40 pounds, combined with her personal gear. Torres and Hayes, playing their roles perfectly, made exaggerated efforts to compensate for her limitations. They stumbled dramatically when trying to help her, complained loudly about the unfair burden, and exchanged meaningful glances that the observers couldn't miss. "This is exactly what we'd face in real deployment," Torres announced, loud enough for the reviewing stand to hear. "One person who can't pull their weight means everyone else has to work twice as hard." The second scenario was worse. Urban combat simulation required teams to clear a mock building while under simulated enemy fire. Sarah's role was communications. She was supposed to coordinate with command while her teammates engaged targets. Morrison had rigged the scenario by assigning her a radio that was deliberately set to the wrong frequency. While Torres and Hayes performed their roles flawlessly, Sarah appeared to be failing at basic communication tasks. Every time she tried to report their position or request support, static filled the airwaves. "Communication breakdown," Morrison noted for the observers. In real combat, this kind of failure gets people killed. Sarah realized what was happening but couldn't prove it without revealing technical knowledge she wasn't supposed to possess. She was trapped in a scenario designed to make her look incompetent, regardless of her actual skills. The final scenario was hand-to-hand combat assessment. Each recruit had to demonstrate defensive techniques against multiple attackers while protecting a simulated wounded soldier. It was meant to test decision-making under pressure, tactical thinking, and combat effectiveness. Morrison paired Sarah against 4 male recruits, including Torres and 2 others who'd been briefed on their roles. The wounded soldier she was supposed to protect was actually Hayes, positioned to make Sarah's job as difficult as possible. "Real combat doesn't provide fair fights," Morrison explained to the observers. "Soldiers need to function effectively, even when outnumbered and outgunned." What followed was carefully choreographed humiliation. The 4 attackers coordinated their assault to make Sarah look clumsy and overwhelmed. Every defensive move she attempted was countered by someone who'd been briefed on her likely responses. Every attempt to protect Hayes was sabotaged by Hayes herself, who would roll away from Sarah's defensive position at crucial moments. But something unexpected happened as the scenario progressed. Sarah's muscle memory began overriding her conscious control. 7 years of suppressed training started bleeding through despite her efforts to maintain Her helpless persona, her footwork became more fluid. Her defensive positioning showed sophistication that shouldn't have been possible for a struggling recruit. Her awareness of multiple attackers demonstrated tactical knowledge that made Morrison's eyes narrow with suspicion. Interesting technique, Colonel Brennan observed, leaning forward in her seat. Where did she learn those defensive patterns? Sarah caught herself and immediately returned to her clumsy, overwhelmed performance. But it was too late. Several observers had noticed the inconsistency between her apparent skill level and her supposed training background. The scenario ended with Sarah on the ground, defeated by her attackers, while Hayes lay dead from wounds. Sarah had failed to prevent. Morrison's smile was triumphant as he addressed the observers. As you can see, some recruits simply lack the fundamental capabilities required for military service. Despite weeks of intensive training, Recruit Chen continues to demonstrate inadequate performance across all combat scenarios. But Colonel Brennan's expression was thoughtful rather than convinced. Sergeant Morrison, I'd like to review Chen's complete training records. Something about her performance pattern seems inconsistent. That evening, Sarah sat in her bunk knowing that her time was running out. Morrison's plan was working. She was being positioned for dismissal based on documented performance failures. But she'd also seen something in Colonel Brennan's eyes that suggested not everyone was buying Morrison's narrative. Hayes approached her during evening personal time, her expression a mixture of guilt and desperation. "Look, Mouse," she said quietly, "I know today was rough, but you have to understand." "Understand what?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice neutral. "The way things work here. Morrison gets what Morrison wants. Fighting it just makes things worse. For everyone." Hayes glanced around nervously. "You could make this easier on yourself. Put in for a transfer. Claim family emergency, whatever. Just stop making waves." Sarah studied Hayes' face and saw something she hadn't expected: fear. Hayes wasn't just following orders or seeking social acceptance. She was terrified of what would happen if she didn't participate in Morrison's system. "What did he promise?" "You, Amanda?" Sarah asked softly. Hayes' composure cracked slightly. "Officer candidate school. Guaranteed placement if I help maintain proper company standards." "And what did he threaten you with if you don't?" The silence stretched long enough to provide its own answer. Hayes wasn't just a bully, she was another victim of Morrison's system, one who'd chosen collaboration over resistance. That night, as Sarah lay awake listening to the sounds of her sleeping company, she made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow was the final week of basic training. Morrison was planning one last demonstration to seal her fate and prove his methods to the visiting officials. But Sarah was done being Morrison's test subject. 7 years of hiding, 7 years of learned helplessness, 7 years of pretending to be less than she was. It all ended now. The mouse was about to remind everyone that she'd once been something much more dangerous. And Morrison's carefully controlled experiment was about to encounter a variable he'd never planned for: the moment when a predator stopped pretending to be prey. Tomorrow, everyone would see what happened when someone pushed Sarah Chen too far. The only question was whether Morrison would survive the lesson he was about to receive. The final confrontation began not with violence, but with meticulous preparation. Sarah spent her last night of invisibility organizing everything she'd discovered into a comprehensive dossier that would be impossible to dismiss or cover up. She'd learned from David Park's successful resistance campaign that evidence without strategy was worthless. She needed leverage, timing, and witnesses. Her plan was elegant in its simplicity. Morrison had scheduled one final demonstration for the visiting officials, a capstone exercise designed to showcase his training methods and justify Sarah's dismissal. He'd positioned it as proof that his psychological conditioning program could identify unsuitable recruits before they became operational liabilities. But Sarah was going to turn his own demonstration against him. She would reveal her true capabilities in front of witnesses who mattered, while simultaneously exposing the systematic abuse that had brought her to this point. The key was timing. She needed to survive long enough to make her revelation count. First, she secured her evidence. Multiple copies of her documentation were hidden throughout the base, with detailed instructions for their discovery if something happened to her. She'd also sent encrypted copies to several external recipients, including Dr. Foster and 2 investigative journalists who specialized in military affairs. Her research had revealed that Colonel Brennan wasn't just a visiting observer. She was leading an unofficial investigation into training irregularities at multiple bases. Morrison didn't know it, but his program was already under scrutiny from higher command levels. Sarah had also identified potential allies among the staff. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who'd humiliated her during hand-to-hand training, had a reputation for ethical conduct that seemed at odds with his participation in Morrison's demonstration. His personnel file revealed commendations for refusing to follow illegal orders during deployment, suggesting he might be someone who could be reached with the right approach. More importantly, she discovered that Dr. Foster hadn't been transferred, as Morrison claimed. He was still on base, continuing his documentation of the pilot program while preparing his final report. Morrison had been lying to his staff about Foster's status, which meant the psychological evaluation program was under more pressure than anyone realized. But the most crucial element of Sarah's plan involved her fellow recruits. Through careful observation and discreet conversations, she'd identified others who were questioning Morrison's methods. Thompson had been keeping his distance publicly, but Sarah had caught him watching Morrison's interactions with calculating eyes. Even Torres, for all his bluster, seemed uncomfortable with the escalating nature of their targeting. The breakthrough came when Sarah approached David Kim during a moment when they were both isolated during equipment maintenance. Kim had been receiving similar treatment to Sarah's systematic harassment, designed to force him out, but he'd been documenting everything with the methodical precision of someone who understood bureaucratic warfare. "I know what they're doing," Kim told her quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "My brother went through this at Fort Stewart. Same tactics, same outcomes. It's not legitimate training, it's experimentation." Kim had been building his own case, gathering evidence and preparing complaints through proper channels. But like Sarah, he'd been isolated and discredited to the point where his allegations would seem like desperate excuses from a failing recruit. "What if we coordinated our response?" Sarah suggested. "Individual complaints can be dismissed. But if multiple recruits with documented evidence present a unified case, Morrison would crush us before we got started," Kim replied. "He controls the narrative here, controls who sees what information. Not if we force him to reveal himself in front of people he can't control." Sarah outlined her plan to Kim, showing him the evidence she'd gathered and explaining how they could use Morrison's own demonstration against him. Kim's background in military protocol, his father was a retired officer, provided crucial insights into how to present their case to maximize impact. "You're talking about ending your military career before it starts," Kim warned. "Even if we expose Morrison, the system protects itself. Whistleblowers don't get promoted, they get transferred to dead-end assignments. Some things are more important than career advancement," Sarah replied. "If we don't stop this here, how many more recruits like us will be broken by this system?" That evening, Sarah made another crucial preparation. She contacted her former martial arts instructor through encrypted messaging. Sensei Williams had been more than a trainer during her competitive years. He'd been a mentor who understood the psychological aspects of combat as well as the physical techniques. "Sarah?" His voice carried surprise and concern when she called. "I haven't heard from you in years. How are you?" "I need advice," she said. Without preamble, about dealing with bullies who think they understand combat, but have never faced real opposition. She explained her situation in general terms, careful not to reveal military specifics, but giving him enough context to understand the dynamics. Williams listened without interruption, his silence communicating the gravity he placed on her words. "You're describing someone who's confused dominance with strength," he finally said. "The kind of person who's never encountered genuine skill disguised as weakness. Do you remember what I taught you about revealing techniques?" Sarah remembered. Williams had specialized in teaching smaller fighters how to use opponents' assumptions against them. The element of surprise was everything, but once revealed, it had to be decisive. "If you're going to show them who you really are," Williams continued, "make sure you do it when it matters most, with witnesses who can't be silenced, and in a way that serves a purpose beyond personal vindication. What if the cost is my future? In the military? Then you have to decide what kind of future you want. One built on hiding who you are, or one where you refuse to let others be destroyed the way they tried to destroy you." After the call ended, Sarah spent an hour in physical preparation, the first time in weeks she'd allowed herself to practice her full range of techniques. Her body responded like a finely tuned instrument that had been temporarily silenced. The muscle memory was perfect, the conditioning still there beneath the carefully maintained facade of weakness. She moved through kata sequences that had once been second nature, each technique flowing into the next with deadly precision. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed someone Morrison had never seen, a martial artist whose skills had been honed by years of competition, against opponents who'd underestimated her just as he was doing now. But Sarah also prepared mentally for the consequences of her revelation. Exposing Morrison might end her military career before it truly began. It would certainly make her enemies among those who benefited from his system. The safe path would be to endure the final week, accept discharge, and disappear back into civilian invisibility. Instead, she was choosing to fight not just for herself, but for every recruit who'd been broken by Morrison's methods, and for everyone who would face his system in the future. As she settled into her bunk for the last time as Mouse Chun, struggling recruit, Sarah felt a calm certainty settle over her. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or destruction, but it would also bring truth. Morrison had spent weeks trying to break her down to nothing. Instead, he'd created something far more dangerous, a warrior with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The mouse was about to disappear forever, replaced by someone Morrison had never encountered and wasn't prepared to handle. The final demonstration was less than 12 hours away. Sarah was ready. The morning of the final demonstration dawned clear and cold, with visiting officials from 3 different bases assembled to witness what Morrison had billed as a definitive assessment of modern training effectiveness. Colonel Brennan sat in the front row of the reviewing stand, flanked by 2 brigadier generals and several senior staff officers, whose presence suggested this was more than a routine evaluation. Sarah moved through morning preparations with the same careful invisibility she'd maintained for 7 weeks, but something fundamental had changed. Her movements carried a subtle confidence that sharp eyes might have noticed, a predatory awareness that had been carefully hidden beneath layers of learned helplessness. Morrison briefed his staff with evident satisfaction. "Today we demonstrate why proper psychological conditioning is essential for military readiness. Chun represents everything wrong with lowered standards: physical inadequacy, mental weakness, and inability to function under realistic pressure." The final exercise was called Command Under Fire, a complex scenario where individual recruits had to assume leadership during simulated crisis situations. Each recruit would face multiple challenges designed to test decision-making, physical capability, and psychological resilience under extreme stress. Morrison had saved Sarah for last, positioning her demonstration as the culmination of his presentation. He'd stacked every element against her. The scenario required someone to coordinate a team response While personally engaging multiple physical challenges, the environmental conditions were designed to favor larger recruits, and the evaluation criteria emphasized areas where she'd consistently shown apparent weakness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison announced to the assembled observers, "our final demonstration will showcase the importance of realistic standards in military training. Sometimes the greatest kindness is honest assessment of limitations before they become battlefield liabilities." The scenario began with Sarah leading a 4-person team through a mock rescue operation. They had to extract simulated wounded personnel from a collapsed building while under enemy fire, coordinate with air support, and establish a defensive perimeter, all within a strict time limit. For the first phase, Sarah followed the script Morrison expected. She appeared to struggle with the radio equipment, seemed overwhelmed by the multiple demands of leadership, and looked physically outmatched by the challenges. Torres and Hayes played their roles perfectly, demonstrating visible frustration with her apparent incompetence. But Colonel Brennan was watching with the trained eye of someone who'd seen real combat leadership, and something about Sarah's struggles seemed inconsistent. Her radio procedures, while apparently flawed, showed underlying knowledge of proper military communication protocols. Her positioning during the exercise revealed tactical awareness that shouldn't have been possible for someone with her training. Background: the turning point came when Morrison decided to escalate the scenario beyond its planned parameters. Frustrated by Sarah's refusal to completely break down, he added unscripted elements designed to force her into total failure. "Chen," Morrison's voice boomed across the training ground as he strode into the exercise area. "Your team is getting people killed. You're not fit to lead a Girl Scout troop, much less soldiers in combat." He positioned himself directly in front of Sarah, using his massive physical presence to intimidate her in full view of the observers. "This is what happens when we lower standards to accommodate feelings instead of focusing on capability." Morrison reached out to physically remove the radio from Sarah's hands, a move designed to publicly strip her of leadership authority and demonstrate her helplessness. But as his hand closed around the radio, something shifted in Sarah's stance. For 7 weeks, she'd absorbed every humiliation, endured every punishment, accepted every public demonstration of her supposed inadequacy. But this moment, Morrison's attempt to physically dominate her in front of witnesses who mattered finally triggered the response she'd been suppressing. As Morrison pulled the radio away, Sarah moved with lightning speed that shocked everyone watching. Her left hand captured Morrison's wrist in a control grip that locked his arm in place, while her right hand struck a precise pressure point that momentarily disrupted his nervous system. Morrison, all 250 pounds of him, found himself suddenly off balance as Sarah executed a textbook hip throw that used his own momentum and size against him. The technique was so perfect, so precisely applied, that Morrison had no opportunity to resist or recover. He flew through the air and crashed to the ground with earth-shaking impact, his massive frame hitting the dirt with a sound that echoed across the suddenly silent training ground. For a moment, absolute stillness gripped the entire exercise area. Morrison lay on his back, stunned and gasping, while Sarah stood over him in a perfect fighting stance that revealed years of advanced martial arts training. "What the hell?" Morrison began as he struggled to rise, but Sarah was already moving. Before he could regain his feet, she flowed into a submission hold that pinned him face down in the dirt. Her technique was so advanced, so perfectly executed, that even the experienced military observers recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. "I said stop." Sarah's voice carried a quiet authority that cut through Morrison's struggles. For the first time in 7 weeks, she wasn't speaking as Mouse Chun, struggling recruit. She was speaking as someone who possessed skills Morrison couldn't comprehend. Morrison thrashed against the hold, but Sarah's positioning was perfect. Every movement he made only tightened her control, demonstrating a level of grappling expertise that was completely inconsistent with her supposed background. Let me go. You little. Morrison's words cut off as Sarah applied just enough pressure to remind him how helpless his position really was. Drill Sergeant Morrison, Sarah said clearly, loud enough for all observers to hear. I'm going to release this hold. You're going to remain on the ground until the reviewing officers can assess what just happened here. She released him and stepped back, maintaining perfect defensive positioning as Morrison climbed slowly to his feet. His face was purple with rage and humiliation, but something in Sarah's stance warned him against immediate retaliation. Colonel Brennan was already striding onto the field, her expression a mixture of fascination and concern. Recruit Chen, where exactly did you learn those techniques? Sarah met her gaze directly. Ma'am, I believe this demonstration has revealed several things that require immediate investigation. Behind her, Torres and Hayes stared in complete shock. David Kim, who'd been watching from the sidelines, stepped forward with a folder in his hands. Colonel, Kim announced, we have documentation that explains everything you just witnessed. Morrison's face went white as he realized that his perfect demonstration had just become his downfall. The mouse he'd spent 7 weeks trying to break had just revealed herself to be something he'd never encountered, a predator who'd been waiting for exactly the right moment to strike back. The silence stretched as observers processed what they'd witnessed. In 30 seconds, Sarah had destroyed 7 weeks of carefully constructed narrative and exposed Morrison's methods for what they really were. The explosion he'd been trying to prevent had just occurred in front of the people who mattered most, and this was only the beginning. The immediate aftermath of Morrison's humiliation unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of military protocol and barely controlled chaos. Colonel Brennan's command voice cut through the stunned silence with surgical precision. All personnel, except essential leadership, return to barracks immediately. Drill Sergeant Morrison, report to the command post. Recruit Chen, you'll remain here for debriefing. As the training ground cleared, Sarah found herself facing a semicircle of senior officers whose expressions ranged from fascination to barely contained fury. Morrison stood to one side, his uniform disheveled and his authority visibly shattered, while Staff Sergeant Williams hovered nearby looking like a man watching his career implode in real time. David Kim stepped forward with his folder of documentation, but Colonel Brennan held up a hand to stop him. Her attention was focused entirely on Sarah, studying her with the intensity of someone solving a complex puzzle. Recruit Chen, Brennan began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to getting truthful answers. I'm going to ask you some direct questions, and I expect complete honesty. First, what is your actual martial arts background? Sarah straightened to full attention, her posture now reflecting confidence she'd hidden for 7 weeks. Ma'am, I hold black belt rankings in 3 different disciplines and competed nationally for 5 years before enlisting. I was regionally ranked in 2 weight divisions. Murmurs rippled through the assembled officers. One of the brigadier generals leaned forward with obvious interest. Why wasn't this information in your enlistment records? Sir, it was. But I was advised during intake that prior martial arts experience might lead to unwanted attention during basic training. I was told it would be better to develop military fighting techniques from scratch rather than rely on civilian training. Morrison's face darkened further as the implications sank in. Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. More importantly, sir, I've documented extensive evidence of systematic abuse disguised as legitimate training methodology. What you witnessed today was the culmination of 7 weeks of deliberate psychological and physical harassment designed to force me out of the military. Colonel Brennan's expression sharpened. Elaborate on that accusation, recruit. David Kim stepped forward again, this time without interruption. Ma'am, with permission, we've prepared comprehensive documentation of irregular training practices. At Fort Riverside, Kim opened his folder and began distributing copies to each officer. The documentation was extensive photos, audio recordings, testimony from former recruits, medical records showing suspicious injury patterns, and financial records indicating unauthorized experimental programs. The evidence shows, Kim continued, that Drill Sergeant Morrison has been conducting unauthorized psychological conditioning experiments on selected recruits. The goal appears to be developing methods for eliminating soldiers deemed undesirable through systematic abuse disguised as legitimate training failures. Morrison finally found his voice, though it carried none of its usual commanding authority. "This is ridiculous. Chen is a discipline problem who's been creating disruption since day one. She just assaulted a superior officer in front of witnesses." "Actually," said a new voice from behind the group, "she demonstrated textbook defensive techniques against what could be interpreted as assault by a superior officer." Dr. Michael Foster approached the group, carrying a thick file folder and wearing the expression of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. His presence seemed to drain what little color remained in Morrison's face. "Dr. Foster," Colonel Brennan acknowledged. "I was told you'd been transferred." "That was misinformation, ma'am. I've been completing my assessment of the psychological conditioning pilot program operating at this facility." Foster opened his folder, revealing hundreds of pages of clinical documentation. "My findings support every allegation these recruits are making." Foster's report was devastating in its clinical precision. He documented systematic abuse patterns, identified psychological manipulation techniques that violated military regulations, and traced the unauthorized nature of Morrison's experimental methods. "The program operating here," Foster explained, "violates basic principles of military training psychology. Rather than building resilience, it's designed to identify and eliminate recruits based on demographic profiles rather than actual capability." One of the brigadier generals studied Sarah with renewed interest. "Recruit Chen, given your actual skill level, why did you endure 7 weeks of this treatment instead of revealing your capabilities immediately?" Sarah's answer carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Sir, because I wanted to understand the full scope of what was happening here. Individual complaints can be dismissed as sour grapes from failing recruits. But systematic abuse documented over time, with multiple witnesses and extensive evidence, becomes much harder to ignore or cover up." The questioning continued for over an hour, with each piece of evidence building an increasingly damning picture of Morrison's operation. Sarah and Kim had documented everything: the rigged equipment, the impossible standards, the deliberate isolation tactics, and the systematic targeting of recruits who fit specific psychological profiles. Most damaging was the audio recording Sarah had captured of Morrison's staff meeting, where he'd discussed accelerating psychological breakdown and revealed the true nature of his selection criteria. When the recording finished playing, the silence was deafening. Morrison stood rigidly at attention, but his defiance had crumbled into resignation. Williams looked like a man contemplating early retirement. Colonel Brennan closed her copy of the documentation and fixed Morrison with a stare that could have melted steel. "Drill Sergeant Morrison, you are hereby relieved of training duties pending a full investigation. Staff Sergeant Williams, you'll report to my office within the hour." She turned back to Sarah, her expression shifting from official sternness to something approaching respect. "Recruit Chen, your actions today have likely prevented countless future recruits from experiencing similar abuse. However, I need to ask, what are your intentions regarding military service?" Sarah considered the question carefully. 7 weeks ago, she would have said anything to avoid attention. Now, having rediscovered who she was beneath the carefully constructed invisibility, her answer came without hesitation. "Ma'am, I enlisted to serve my country and challenge myself to become better than I was. If the military can provide that opportunity without requiring me to hide my capabilities or accept systematic abuse, then I'd like to continue serving." One of the brigadier generals smiled, the first positive expression Sarah had seen from senior leadership since arriving at Fort Riverside. "I think we can arrange something more suitable to your actual skill level, Recruit Chen." As the officers dispersed to begin what would clearly be extensive investigation, Sarah found herself approached by several of her fellow recruits. Torres, looking thoroughly chastened, offered an awkward apology. "I had no idea," he said quietly. Morrison made it seem like we were helping maintain standards." Even Hayes approached, her usual confidence replaced by something approaching humility. "You could have destroyed me during any of those scenarios," she realized. "You were holding back the entire time." Sarah studied the faces around her recruits who'd participated in her humiliation, either actively or passively, now seeing her clearly for the first time. "The point wasn't to prove I was better than anyone," she said simply. "The point was to prove that the system was broken and that it needed to be fixed before it broke anyone else." As the base settled into the chaos of investigation and reorganization, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 7 years: complete honesty about who she was. The mouse was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger than she'd been before, not just because of her martial arts skills, but because she'd learned to fight for something larger than herself. Morrison's experiment in breaking her had succeeded in ways he never intended. He'd broken down the frightened girl who'd been hiding her strength and revealed the warrior who'd been waiting underneath all along. The investigation that followed, Sarah's revelation, moved with the swift efficiency of a military operation designed to contain a spreading crisis. Within 24 hours, investigators from the Army Criminal Investigation Command had descended on Fort Riverside, armed with subpoenas, recording equipment, and a mandate to uncover the full scope of Morrison's unauthorized program. Colonel Brennan established a temporary command center in the base's conference facility, coordinating between multiple investigative agencies while ensuring that affected recruits received proper support. The scope of the investigation expanded rapidly as evidence revealed connections to similar programs at other training facilities. Sarah found herself at the center of a bureaucratic hurricane, providing testimony to investigators, military lawyers, and congressional staffers who'd been alerted to the situation. Her documentation became the foundation for what would eventually become the largest investigation into training abuse in modern military history. "Your evidence gathering was remarkably thorough," commented Agent Patricia Walsh, the lead SEAD investigator assigned to the case. "Most whistleblower cases struggle with documentation this comprehensive." Sarah's careful preparation proved crucial as investigators traced the full network of Morrison's operation. The financial records she'd uncovered led to discoveries of funding streams from undisclosed sources, experimental protocols that violated both military regulations and federal law, and a web of officials who'd either actively supported or deliberately ignored the abuse. Dr. Foster's clinical documentation provided the psychological framework for understanding how the program operated. His testimony revealed that Morrison's methods weren't just cruel, they were scientifically designed to identify and exploit specific psychological vulnerabilities in targeted recruits. "The selection criteria weren't random," Foster explained during one lengthy deposition. "They specifically targeted individuals from backgrounds that made them less likely to be believed if they complained. Foster care histories, lack of family support, previous experiences with institutional authority." The investigation revealed that Sarah's experience was part of a broader pattern affecting dozens of recruits across multiple training cycles. Former soldiers came forward with stories that painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning several years, all disguised as legitimate military training. David Kim's documentation proved equally valuable, particularly his analysis of how the program connected to broader military policies about recruitment standards and personnel retention. His background in military protocol helped investigators understand how Morrison had managed to operate with apparent official sanction while actually violating numerous regulations. The genius of the system, Kim explained to investigators, was that it created plausible deniability at every level. Recruits washed out due to documented performance failures, so there was no obvious pattern of discrimination. The abuse was disguised as legitimate training stress. As the investigation progressed, more disturbing details emerged. Medical records showed suspicious patterns of injuries among targeted recruits, stress fractures, psychological breaks, and mysterious performance degradations that couldn't be explained by normal training progression. Financial investigators uncovered payments to medical personnel who'd provided questionable diagnoses, athletic commissions who'd overlooked obvious irregularities, and administrative staff who'd altered records to support Morrison's narrative of legitimate training failures. Most shocking was the discovery that Morrison's program had unofficial support from certain military officials who believed traditional basic training was insufficient for modern warfare challenges. They'd seen his experimental methods as a way to accelerate the identification of unsuitable recruits and reduce long-term military costs. The congressional hearings that followed captured national attention, with Sarah's testimony becoming a watershed moment in discussions about military training reform. Her appearance before the House Armed Services Committee was broadcast live, showing the country a young woman who'd survived systematic abuse and emerged stronger than before. The issue isn't that military training should be easy, Sarah told the committee, her voice carrying across the packed hearing room. The issue is that abuse disguised as training serves no legitimate military purpose and creates exactly the kind of psychological damage that makes soldiers less effective, not more. Her testimony was compelling not just because of what she'd endured, but because of how she'd documented and exposed the system. Military leaders found themselves unable to dismiss her allegations as the complaints of a failing recruit. Her evidence was too comprehensive, her analysis too sophisticated, her ultimate success too undeniable. The legal consequences for Morrison and his staff were severe. Morrison faced court-martial on charges including abuse of authority, violation of military regulations, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Staff Sergeant Williams received lesser charges but faced dismissal from service and loss of retirement benefits. Broadly, the investigation led to policy changes affecting military training across all service branches. New oversight protocols were established, psychological evaluation procedures were reformed, and specific protections were implemented for recruits who reported abuse. Dr. Foster was appointed to lead a new military psychology initiative focused on identifying and preventing training abuse. His first recommendation was the establishment of independent oversight boards at all training facilities, staffed by personnel who couldn't be influenced by local command structures. The ripple effects extended beyond individual prosecutions to fundamental changes in how military training was conceptualized and regulated. Sarah's case became a textbook example used in military leadership courses, demonstrating both the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of protecting institutional whistleblowers. Several officers who'd supported or ignored Morrison's program faced disciplinary action, including forced retirement and loss of promotion opportunities. The message sent through the military hierarchy was clear: abuse would not be tolerated, and those who enabled it would face consequences. For Sarah, the investigation period was both vindication and challenge. She'd succeeded in exposing systematic abuse, but the process required her to relive traumatic experiences while maintaining emotional stability under intense scrutiny. The support she received from unexpected sources proved crucial to her recovery. Fellow recruits who'd initially participated in her harassment approached her with genuine apologies and requests to testify on her behalf. Military personnel who'd witnessed Morrison's methods but felt powerless to intervene came forward with additional evidence. Most meaningful was a letter she received from Marcus Rodriguez, one of the former recruits whose story had helped her Understand the scope of Morrison's operation. You did what I couldn't, he wrote. You found a way to fight back that actually worked. Because of you, others won't have to go through what we did. As the formal investigation concluded and legal proceedings moved forward, Sarah faced a choice about her military future. The Army had offered her several options: transfer to a different training program, direct assignment to specialized units that could utilize her martial arts expertise, or honorable discharge with full benefits if she preferred to pursue civilian opportunities. The decision would determine not just her career path, but how she chose to use the platform her courage had created. She'd become a symbol of resistance against institutional abuse, and her next steps would influence whether that symbol inspired lasting change or faded into military history. The girl who'd arrived at Fort Riverside hoping to disappear had instead become someone who couldn't be ignored. The question now was what she would do with the visibility she'd never wanted, but had earned through her refusal to be broken. 6 months after flipping Drill Sergeant Morrison in front of horrified military officials, Sarah Chen stood in her new office at the Pentagon, reviewing training reform proposals that would affect thousands of future recruits. Her official title was Special Advisor for Training Ethics and Oversight, but everyone who mattered knew her real role. She was the person who'd blown up the old system and was now helping build something better. The transformation had been as dramatic as it was unexpected. Instead of washing out of basic training as Morrison had planned, Sarah had been fast-tracked through an accelerated program designed for recruits with exceptional potential. Her martial arts background, combined with the leadership she demonstrated during the investigation, had caught the attention of senior commanders looking for innovative approaches to military training. Her new assignment placed her at the intersection of policy, development, and practical application, working with training facilities across all service branches to implement the reforms her case had inspired. It was challenging work that required diplomatic skills she'd never known she possessed, but it was also deeply meaningful in ways her previous civilian jobs had never been. The office phone rang, interrupting her review of incident reports from Fort Benning. "Sarah, this is Colonel Brennan. Do you have a few minutes? There's someone here who'd like to meet you." Brennan's voice carried a warmth that would have been unimaginable during those tense days at Fort Riverside. She'd become not just Sarah's supervisor but something approaching a mentor, helping her navigate the complex world of military politics while maintaining the integrity that had driven her initial resistance. The someone turned out to be Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, Sarah's former fellow recruit who'd just completed officer candidate school with honors. His presence brought back memories of those difficult weeks when he'd been one of the few voices willing to defend her, even briefly. "I wanted to thank you personally," Thompson said, his new lieutenant's bars gleaming on his collar. "Not just for what you did at Riverside, but for what you've done since. The changes you've helped implement, they're making a real difference." Sarah studied his face, seeing confidence and purpose that had been carefully hidden during basic training. "You would have succeeded regardless, Marcus. You had the character for this from the beginning." "Maybe," he replied, "but I wouldn't have learned what real leadership looks like without watching how you handled Morrison. You showed all of us what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself." Thompson's visit was part of a pattern that had developed over the months since the investigation concluded. Former recruits, military personnel, and even civilian advocacy groups regularly sought her input on training issues, institutional reform, and whistleblower protection. She'd become an unofficial expert on military culture change, despite never having intended such a role. The most meaningful contact had come from unexpected sources: letters from recruits currently in training who'd heard about her case and found courage to report their own experiences with abusive instructors. Each letter represented another young person who wouldn't suffer in silence, another potential Morrison whose methods would be exposed before they could cause lasting damage. Dr. Foster stopped by her office regularly, sharing updates on the psychological research that had grown out of their shared experience. His work on identifying and preventing training abuse had become a model for other military psychologists, and he often credited Sarah's documentation with providing the foundation for his ongoing research. "Your case changed everything," he told her during one of their weekly meetings. "Not just the policies, but the way people think about institutional power and individual resistance. You proved that one person with sufficient preparation and courage could challenge systems that seemed untouchable." The broader impact extended far beyond military training. Sarah's testimony during congressional hearings had inspired legislative changes affecting multiple federal agencies, creating new protections for whistleblowers and establishing independent oversight mechanisms for institutional training programs at universities. Police academies and corporate training programs had all implemented reforms based on lessons learned from the Fort Riverside investigation. The principles she demonstrated: careful documentation, strategic timing, and focus on systemic change rather than personal revenge had become a template for effective institutional resistance. But perhaps the most important legacy was personal. David Kim had followed his own path through military service, specializing in military justice and using his legal training to advocate for fair treatment of enlisted personnel. He'd become a JAG officer whose reputation for defending soldiers against institutional abuse was already legendary. Despite his junior rank, Hayes and Torres had both completed their military training successfully, but with a fundamentally different understanding of leadership and ethical responsibility. Hayes had become an advocate for inclusive training practices, using her experience as someone who'd participated in systemic abuse to help others recognize and resist similar situations. "I was so focused on fitting in that I forgot what I was supposed to be fitting into," Hayes had written in a letter to Sarah. "You reminded all of us that military service is supposed to be about something more than just following orders and maintaining hierarchy." Even former Drill Sergeant Morrison, now serving a reduced sentence after cooperating with investigators, had sent an unexpected message through his lawyer. His statement, read during his sentencing hearing, included an acknowledgement that Sarah's resistance had ultimately saved him from becoming something he'd never intended to be. "I convinced myself that breaking people down was building them up," his statement read. "Chun showed me the difference between legitimate military training and systematic abuse. I wish I'd understood that difference before I caused so much harm." As Sarah reviewed her calendar for the coming week meetings with training commanders, congressional staffers, and advocacy groups, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened girl who'd enlisted hoping to disappear had become someone whose voice carried weight in the highest levels of military leadership. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jenny, her former foster sister who'd stayed in touch throughout the investigation and beyond. "Saw the news story about the new training reforms. Proud of you, sis. Still think you're the toughest person I know." Attached was a photo from a recent military ceremony where Sarah had received a commendation for her contributions to training reform. In the photo, she stood tall and confident, wearing a uniform that represented not just military service, but the principle that institutions could be changed by individuals willing to fight for what was right. The mouse they'd tried to break had indeed disappeared, replaced by someone stronger than anyone had imagined possible. But the real transformation wasn't about physical capability or martial arts skills. It was about the discovery that courage, properly applied, could reshape entire systems. Sarah's story had become larger than her individual experience, inspiring a generation of service members to believe that positive change was possible, even within rigid institutional structures. The quiet girl who'd once perfected the art of being invisible had learned that sometimes the most important thing you could do was refuse to disappear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.